Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, August 8th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. At the end of July, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada plans to recognize the State of Palestine by September. An initiative he said will depend on the Palestinian Authority committing to what he described as much-needed reforms. In this episode, Rabble editor Nick Seebruch sits down with Jason Toney, Director of Media Advocacy at Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, to unpack Carney's remarks and the political conditions attached to them. They explore what these conditions could mean in practice, and also delve into CJPME's ongoing efforts to promote fair and accurate media coverage of Palestine in Canada. Here is that conversation. Take a listen.
Jason, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation.
Could you tell us a little bit about Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East and what you do there?
Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or CJPME for short, is a long-standing advocacy group. We're based in Montreal, and most of our work surrounds Palestinian human rights. So we do lobbying on Parliament Hill. We have grassroots chapters across the country that we work with. We just launched a lobby corps, which has brought together lots of experts in different fields who are working with us to accomplish different goals. And what I do is I run our Media Accountability Project, which attempts to hold Canadian media outlets accountable for their coverage about Palestine and the region. So we have our tentacles in a little bit of everything. We've been around for 20 years, and we continue to grow and try new things. So if you want to check us out, it's cjpme.org.
All right. And one of the things I wanted to discuss with you today, because obviously, since there's the ongoing war, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, there's been some significant developments over the past few weeks in terms of recognition of Palestinian statehood. Last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada would recognize a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in September, alongside other countries like France. I wanted to ask, why is it important for Canada to recognize a Palestinian state?
Well, I'd first say that there is some disagreement among advocates and Palestinians themselves on the question of Palestinian statehood. And I would say that CJPME as an organization is somewhat agnostic on this particular question. We think what's important is Palestinian self-determination. And there are different imaginations about the best way to get there. Now, there are a lot of people in Canada who have been advocating for statehood for a very long time, and this was an important moment to see the Canadian Prime Minister step forward and say we're going to take that step. And many people understandably view that as a major victory, and I think there's no reason to come down negatively on that view. I think that's a very reasonable position to have, and I think if people want to celebrate that decision, they're well within their rights to. There are a group of people who don't think that statehood is a crucial step in Palestinian self-determination, who believe in things like a one-state solution. And there are a whole variety of views within that of what that could look like. But without getting into all of those details, I would say there isn't a universal kind of position that's held by Palestine advocates on this question. CJPME cautiously welcomed the announcement by Prime Minister Mark Carney, but we had a number of concerns about the announcement.
Okay, and what were some of those concerns?
It feels shallow, let's say, to recognize a Palestinian state while actively arming the military that's attempting a genocide against its people. So one of our major concerns is that statehood recognition by Canada isn't meaningful unless it comes along with a comprehensive two-way arms embargo. We can talk a little bit more about the report that showed that Canada is still sending arms and weapons components to Israel, but that's one really key thing that we're concerned about. And another issue is there's no sweeping sanctions against Israel like there were against Russia that Canada passed with the war in Ukraine. These are two really key points. Another key point that we wanted to see was a commitment to investigate companies that are breaking the limited arms embargo that's in place now. So without Canada taking these meaningful steps to actually support the Palestinian right enshrined in international law to self-determination, recognizing the state is not a particularly meaningful action. And indeed, we're concerned that this was done in part to distract from the very serious allegations against the Canadian government and Canadian companies that are participating in different ways and to varying degrees in the genocide that's going on in Gaza, as well as the brutal ongoing occupation in the West Bank and just the apartheid regime in general.
Now, that's an interesting perspective that it was done primarily from a sort of a cynical political view on the liberals to distract from other things. So does the recognition of a Palestinian statehood by Canada have any real positive impacts for Palestinians?
Well, it might, it's to be seen, but on top of the concerns I laid out, one of the other major worries we have is the conditions that were tacked on to the statehood recognition. So if the idea is Canada will recognize a Palestinian state so long as Canada is allowed to interfere in their elections and decide who can run and who can't. That's extraordinarily worrying. That's anti-democratic. This is not an endorsement of a particular group in Palestine. It's just to say that the idea of self-determination means the Palestinian people themselves should be deciding who their elected leaders are, and Canada should have absolutely no say in who's running and who's not. So we're really worried about the various conditions that were announced by Mark Carney as well as other governments in Europe.
And one of those conditions that Carney called for was essentially demilitarization of Palestinians. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that because, often when we think of states, that's one of the basic guarantees that they can provide to their citizens is protection from external military threats.
Yeah, I mean, Palestinians have a right to resist, also enshrined in international law, and stripping Palestinians of that right again undermines their ability to defend themselves, to have this basic right of self-determination. So to try to demilitarize Palestinians as they're facing this overwhelming asymmetrical violence, it's just wrong.
Now, you've mentioned some of the issues with Canada recognizing a Palestinian state, particularly with conditions that Canada has said they would put on such a state. What should Canada be doing if its goal is a two-state solution and the creation of a Palestinian state? What should Canada be doing to help ensure that happens?
Well, if Canada is going to stick to the two-state solution, if that's going to be the position of Canada, which again, there are strong criticisms of that plan, they should certainly do away with the conditions that they announced and make clear that they're not going to enforce those. And if they want to meaningfully contribute to a two-state solution or any kind of solution for Palestinian people that ensures that their rights are protected, what we need again is a comprehensive two-way arms embargo. We need sanctions and we need to investigate the companies that are violating the embargo we have in place and anything we put in place in the future. If we do those things, then we can say, okay, Canada is trying to make some meaningful inroads and make a difference in the region. Those are really the primary things that Canada can be doing to contribute to this process. Anything short of that is really just politicking. It's totally unserious.
Now, you mentioned sanctions on Israel in connection with the recognition of a Palestinian state. What does that mean to sanction Israel, and what does that look like, and what would Canada need to do?
Yeah, I think that what CJPME has pointed out is Canadian sanctions against Israel should probably look something like what we did against Russia. Again, this is not us endorsing those sanctions or saying they were right or wrong, but that type of sanction package is the sort of thing that Canada has done before, that we've shown is possible, and should be on the table. And there will be a push. There will be a push by activists to make this happen. We're pushing for it now, and there will be things to watch around sanctions in the future. But the sanctions that Canada has passed to date are extremely limited. You know, they've targeted, in general, the West, its sanctions have targeted maybe a couple of Israeli ministers, maybe is extremist settlers, things like that. But what we really need is a sweeping sanctions package that punishes Israel for its genocide in Gaza and for its other violations of international law. And we need to take seriously the reports of human rights organizations across the world, as well as in Israel and in Palestine, and take their concerns and their reports seriously and their recommendations seriously, and pass sweeping sanctions that target wide swaths of Israel and its military industrial complex.
Now, part of that military industrial complex, as you've mentioned several times so far in this interview, are arms that it receives from Canada. Some listeners may be surprised, that Canada provides such weapons to Israel, especially, considering the scale of the military industrial complex in our neighbor to the south, how well known they are for being the world's largest arms dealer. So, in terms of what Canada is sending, what is Canada shipping to Israel in terms of weapons?
Yeah, so there was a bombshell report that was put out by the Arms Embargo Now coalition, which CJPME is a part of. And what we saw in that report was that Canada is sending bullets, different, one of the major things that we're sending is components for F-35 fighter jets, explosive devices or parts for them. There's a huge array of different items that Canadian companies are sending to Israel. Some of this is being sent directly from Canada to Israel. Some of it has been found to go through the US in a loophole. And the Canadian government, so far, rather than take these allegations, which are backed by evidence from Israel itself, as well as Canada itself, and the various tax and export authorities and import authorities, but rather than take the evidence seriously, Canada has attempted to dismiss them, call them flawed, and more evidence keeps coming out to contradict the Canadian government's stance on this.
So, just to clarify, is this the Canadian government itself sending these weapons to Israel, or is this individual companies sending weapons to Israel as part of their own, operations and business deals and things like that?
Yeah, so it's Canadian companies using permits approved by the Canadian government. Now, about a year and a half ago, the Canadian government said it would end all arms and weapon component sales to Israel point blank. But what we found is they canceled a number of permits and they did not renew new ones, so they claimed, but a number of permits were left open. And various Canadian companies have continued using existing permits to send these weapons and components to Israel. So Canada's role is in stopping the permits, all of them, the old ones, and preventing any new ones. And the government has been extremely sloppy in how it's dealt with this. It first said that no arms would go to Israel. And then, in its rejection of our report, it said that no arms would go to Israel that could be used in Gaza. That qualifier that could be used in Gaza is extremely important because there's no monitoring mechanism in place to know if any arms that are being sent to Israel are actually going to be used in Gaza or not. There is no system in place in which Canada could have any certainty around that. So it is a total cop-out and it's clearly deceptive. And now we've even seen in Minister Anita Anand's latest rejection of the report, they changed again to saying we will only send components and weapons to Israel that could be used to protect civilians. No one has any idea what that means and how we can have any guarantees around that. So we just need to see all of the permits that exist closed, and we need to prevent any new ones from opening, and we need to make sure that Canadian companies who are continuing to send these arms were doing so in accordance with the permits that did still exist. And if they weren't, there needs to be severe consequences for that. And we need to continue to do everything we can to ensure no more arms are going to Israel, period. No qualifiers.
Now, about those qualifiers and that response to the arms embargo report, one particular thing I noted from Foreign Minister Anita Anand's response was Anand had said that things that were characterized as bullets were actually paintball style projectiles. I just wanted to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, well, hopefully listeners will have heard by the time this comes out, media reports um, showing that Anand's claims are categorically false because there are special codes associated with Canadian exports, as well as on the Israeli side of what was imported. And what we see is that the bullets sent, many of them were categorized as military bullets, as live ammunition, not as training ammunition, not as blanks or as paintball style ammunition or anything of the sort. So either the Canadian government is lying or the actual codes associated with these bullets that were recorded by government institutions were wrong.
Okay, and another issue that you had mentioned earlier that I wanted to touch base on quickly was that the Canadian government, the House of Commons, had passed a resolution that was initiated by the NDP in the spring of 2024 that did call for an end to all arms sales to Israel. And I think some listeners might be frustrated to learn that that hasn't been followed through on and be wanting to understand why the Canadian government didn't follow through on its own commitment on that. What was it? Outside pressures from pro-Israel activists who pressured the Canadian government to continue selling arms in some way, or did the government just never intend to follow through on that to begin with?
Well, certainly these loopholes were left open and companies took advantage of them. What the intention of the Canadian government actually was, I can't be sure. And what role the pro-Israel lobby might have played, again, we can't be sure. But what we do know is that this is big business, right? We've seen recorded um, millions and millions of dollars of this trade occurring. So certainly there is a economic incentive for these companies to find these loopholes and continue sending these arms. So while I can't quite comment on intention, it does seem like there is a profit motive here that is very strong.
Now, another aspect of the work that CJPME does is holding media accountable. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a new book that recently came out, When Genocide Wasn't News, that I know you had a hand in putting together. I was wondering, can you tell me a little bit about what you learned in the creation of that book about how media has handled the genocide in Gaza?
I'd invite any listener who wants to learn more about Canadian media complicity in the genocide to pick up a copy of When Genocide Wasn't News. It's really and I don't say this just because I'm an editor, but because the work of the contributors is so strong. It's a remarkable it's a remarkable look at the different ways in which media complicity manifests, not only in the coverage itself, but things going on behind the scenes in the newsroom. Yeah, what we saw is that the media is very disciplined in its effort to protect the interests that the West has in maintaining what is effectively a proxy state in the region. There is a huge number of interests in protecting Israel and its status. Um, and yeah, we see that journalists are being punished when they try to do fair coverage of the region. We've seen attempts to just cover up the extent of the destruction that's happening in Gaza and the reality of life in the West Bank. And yeah, in general, I think when it comes to the current situation, what I would say is we continue to see Israeli denials prioritized in all media coverage. So what this looks like is basically any media report you listen to will have at some point Israel says. And as far as we're concerned, Israel says is not journalism because what we found is that Israel lies constantly. And there has been a shift lately in Canadian media coverage of what's going on in Gaza to some extent. I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming shift, but there is some movement. And it seems like that's related to the dire situation with the forced starvation of people living in Gaza. And we are seeing some decent coverage of the report that we've been talking about. Although it is remarkable that when Mark Carney made his announcement around Palestinian statehood a day after our report came out, no journalist spoke up and asked any questions about the arms report that had just come out. I mean, this is the kind of um, uh, complicity that is just so prevalent, where tough questions just aren't asked. And we see stuff like this constantly. So the media plays an extremely important role in setting the discourse of our country, and the discourse is deeply impoverished, unfortunately. But we are hopeful right now that there could be some movement on arms trade because the evidence is so overwhelming, and we are forcing the media and the government to take it seriously, and we're not allowing them to ignore us. And we have activists all over the country who are ringing the alarm bell very loudly. I mean, in the time I've been doing this work, this feels like the most important moment, um, the most important opportunity to hopefully reduce meaningfully Canada's complicity in what's going on. If we can stop the arms trade and pass sweeping sanctions, that would be a really meaningful step in the right direction.
Jason, just my last question is, if someone's listening to this and they want to get involved in the issue of helping to end the genocide in Gaza and protecting Palestinian rights, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, well, a couple of things that you can immediately do are check out cjpme.org. If you have special skills and you want to contribute, we just launched our Lobby Corps, which has had a huge positive response. We have hundreds of people who are getting involved and contributing their skills to the various efforts that we have going on. If you're interested in media advocacy and challenging the media's bias, you can go to the Media Accountability Project's website. That's a project of CJPME. The website for that is cjpmemap.ca, so cjpmemap.ca. And you can actually join and become a media responder, and we'll send you alerts about media coverage, and you are able to respond as you wish to that coverage to challenge bias or lies that we see in the media. So those are a couple of things you can do, but there are so many groups out there. There's neighborhood groups, doing so many different things. So just encourage you to see what makes the most sense for you and try to get involved and end the genocide and free Palestine.
Jason Toney, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
That was Nick Seebruch with the Director of Media Advocacy at Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, Jason Toney. Thanks so much for that, Jason and Nick. Switching gears now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. For that, let's turn things back over to Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Over to you, Nick.
Starting this week with labor news. A paramedic formerly employed by the York Region Municipality in Ontario is fighting for reinstatement after they were fired for making pro-Palestinian statements online. Catherine Grzychak was fired earlier this summer after accusing Israel of perpetrating a genocide in Gaza and intentionally killing healthcare workers who have been coming to the aid of Palestinians living in the war zone. On Thursday, July 31st, Grzychak, along with representatives from her union, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and other supporters, held a press conference where she announced she would be filing a grievance to contest her termination by the York Region. Staying with labor news, pilots with Air Inuit are warning the communities that they serve that there may be disruptions in their vital service as conciliation talks with their employer continue. The pilots represented by the Canadian branch of the Airline Pilots Association have been in conciliation talks since June. At issue for the pilots are improved wages and more predictable work schedules. In health news, a new op-ed on Rabble from the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada explains that digital platforms like TikTok have become a battleground for the debate over reproductive justice. Mathilde Beauvais explains in the article how the popularity of accounts pushing misinformation about reproductive rights and accounts combating that misinformation have grown exponentially in recent years. Beauvais writes, quote, "In a digital world saturated with distraction and misinformation, truth becomes a form of care." End quote. As always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Narenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.